Great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Rabbi Michael Shire, really Rabbi Dr. Michael Shire, because I've known him since we were teenagers. And even at the age of 13, his Jewish knowledge, his Jewish commitment, and his leadership qualities were all evident. He went on to study Jewish education and become a Jewish educator in Los Angeles for some years, and then returned to this country as head of what was then the Department of Center for Jewish Education, and later as vice principal, I think, of Lair Beck College. You have to correct me. And then he went to the USA, and he's now in Boston, where he's the academic director of Hebrew College in Boston, which is a pluralist rabbinic academy. And he's very well suited to teach us about encountering liberal Judaism and a new Hasidism, both very much in his own right, but also because Art Green is the founder of the rabbinical program and is one of the foremost scholars of Hasidism today. I was fortunate to learn from him also during my stay in the States. So Michael is very qualified in many ways to talk to us. And those of you who remember his talk about Lair Beck will also know that as an educator, he's also a great communicator. So we're in for a real treat tonight.
Thank you, Margaret. That's so nice of you. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to be with LJ again. Thinking particularly about Zohar Collins today and the tragic death of a young member of LJY this past week, and a funeral to come. And as a family of LJY, of liberal Judaism, I think wherever we are, we're mourning the loss of a young man. Terrible tragedy for which our young people are very much affected, and for which his family, of course, we're all thinking about. I am, however, pleased to be with you, and I'm excited about sharing some material about NEO-HASIDISM, and I want to make sure that we learn a little bit about the nature of what it is today, and then I'd love to see whether you feel it has any implications for our lives as liberal Jews. So I'm hoping that we'll have enough time to talk about that. And so I may be going through this material quite quickly, and I apologize for that, but I kind of want to get to the place where we can talk about it. So I might rush through it a little bit. If anything's not clear, feel free to say so. I'm coming at it from really from listening to Rabbi Judith, Rabbi Margaret, and others who in these education hubs and in other places have been talking about, oh, and Rabbi Leah's with us too, talking about now that 120 years of liberal Judaism, it's time to reevaluate our thinking, our ethos, our principles, particularly our theology, and to wonder whether we're still kind of fit for purpose. And whether there are some other new ideas, some new things that we need to incorporate to add on to enrich the wonderful 120 years of liberal Judaism so far. So this really comes from the position and the place of thinking, you know, what is out there that's different, that's new, that's something we may or we may not want to pay attention to. And I'm going to leave it up to you to think about whether this is something that's relevant for you. But I think it's certainly worth learning about, knowing about. As Margaret says, I kind of live inside a neo-Hasidic community at Hebrew College in Boston. The only thing I'll say about that is that we are now the largest rabbinical school in the non-Orthodox world, in the world. So there's something that's drawing particularly young people who want to become leaders in the Jewish community, rabbis, cantors, and educators, to our college in Boston, and it's becoming the place where people really want to be and want to study with people like Rabbi Art Green, who we'll talk about in a minute. So it's interesting, becoming very significant in the North American scene and frankly, in the Israeli non-Orthodox scene as well. So it's time for us to learn a little bit about it. So what I want to start off with is to talking a little bit about Hasidism, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're going to close the book on Hasidism and talk about NEO-HASIDISM. So let me just say a word about Hasidism. So it was a popular revivalist movement in the 1770s, about 250 years ago. And in the Ukraine, which of course, all the places we're learning about are places that the Hasidim flourished. And it emphasized inwardness, enthusiasm for religious activity, joy, and trying to be within God's presence. Standing in God's presence was their key idea, and that they wanted to serve God intimately with a real sense of devotion and immediacy. The word perhaps that's commonly used for that is hitlavut, which really means this kind of flame of passion, flame of devotion. And they really wanted to feel it and feel it as part of their religious expression. So as you know, over time, there were rabbis who were attracted to this renewal. There were communities that were developed. There were all kinds of academies, institutions, yeshivot, schools of learning, and they were studying texts from Jewish tradition, of course, Torah and Mishnah and Talmud, but also other texts like the Zohar, the mystical texts, the other texts of Jewish wisdom. And the three elements were emphasized, that is love of Torah, love of God, and love of the Jewish people. Ahavat Hashem, Ahavat Torah, Ahavat Yisrael. And those were kind of the principles upon which this learning took place. They were very much against anything that was routinized or got stultified, stagnant in Jewish life. And so the people who were not Hasidim in those days were called the Mitnakdim, the people who opposed them, and mainly actually Lithuanian rabbis and leaders. And that became a real, as you probably know, a controversy and a literally sometimes a fight between the two. Of course, the Hasidim developed their renewal approach to Jewish life at a time of great oppression and poverty in Ukraine, a time of the Tsars and of all of the powers that were who were in charge of the Jewish communities at that time without any love or affection for Jewish life. So they were really responding to a real sense of persecution and victimhood. And then, of course, things changed, and they were then combating industrialization and urbanization, and finally secularism. So those were the kind of the sore points that Hasidism wanted to contend with. They did become the dominant force in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, and developed over the 20th century, really from the kind of the First World War onwards. They diminished in their ability to impact Jewish communities, partly because Enlightenment was taking place. There was a great shift to secularism and to modern life, and the kind of that zeal for inner devotion was no longer alive in the same way as it had been before. But also, of course, the Shoah had an enormous impact on Hasidism. Pretty much it killed off, well, unfortunately, tragically to say, the Hasidic communities were very much heavily victims of the Shoah. And it is true to say that Hasidism then ended, I would say, as in the same way that it had been before the First World War. They aligned themselves with the Haredi movement, ironically with that kind of Lithuanian rump of ultra-Orthodoxy. And so today, Hasidism today, which of course is becoming a force again, is not the Hasidism of the 18th century. It's an ultra-Orthodox, highly halachic, very strict, very coercive movement that we see in Israel and in America and other places today. So that's not the Hasidism we are going to talk about, because you can really put a line under all of that, because by the 1920s, there had been an instinct to relook at early Hasidism. And the people who were involved in that were thinkers like Hillel Zeitlin and Martin Buber, and Gershom Scholem as well, a great scholar of Jewish texts. And they, in a sense, they refound the original Jewish texts. They translated them into various languages from Yiddish and from Hebrew, brought them into kind of the modern world. And from the 1920s onwards, a new movement or a new approach to Jewish texts, to Jewish thinking arose, called NEO-HASIDISM. It's not the Hasidism of the people that you think of as Hasids today. It's a neo-Hasidism that goes right back to the early days of the texts of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich, and some of the early rabbis of that movement. It continues, the neo-Hasidic movement continues to kind of look at the inward life of the Jew and of the truths and wisdom that came from those early mystical texts that were derived from the Zohar and from other mystical literature in Jewish life that had gone back since the early Middle Ages. So new insights were being developed, and this was for a new audience. It was no longer for an Orthodox Jewish audience. Neo-Hasidism believes that its audience is humanity, universal humanity, not necessarily for Jews. Neo-Hasids want the Jewish and non-Jewish world to learn about the wisdom of this devotion, this inner devotion to God. So it's become universalized, and it's dismissed and disavowed Hasidic notions of gender and of the separation between Jew and non-Jew. So it no longer, of course, it thinks of itself as a male domain, which Hasidism does today, but rather considers actually all genders, not just male and female, but all genders as emanations of God's Spirit, and makes really very little distinction between Jew and non-Jew. It tries also to dismiss the ideas of the role of the Rabbi in Hasidic life. In other words, it's not interested in the idea of the miracle worker, of the Rabbi, of being an authority in anyone's life, making decisions for you. So it has disavowed all of that connection as well. But it continues to want to affirm Hitlaavut, this kind of passionate devotion to God, and so the ways to live out those Jewish texts, those early Jewish texts, in the modern world. So I want to just emphasize that point, because I want to make it very clear that Neo-Hasidism is not a form of Hasidic life as we know it today. It goes back to an earlier stage of the Hasidic movement, and it disavows anything that the modern Hasidic movement would regard with regard to the Jew and the non-Jew, male and female, the role of the Rebbe. So just want to make sure that we're clear that we're not thinking about, the Hasidic people that, appear so commonly in our mind's eye when we think of the Hasidic community. So we've got to think about something else, something different. So this neo-Hasidic idea becomes quite interesting for us, because as liberal Jews, we've been told by some of the rabbis here and others that we are moving from a modern world into a postmodern world. And in a postmodern world, we have to question again all of the things that the modern world tried to think of as true. That is the limits of science, what science can actually do for us, the difference between the notion of truth and wisdom, what wisdom is and what truth is, what is truth for us these days in all respects of our lives, and how the notions of progressive revelation that was taught by our founders has been stymied, that we're not moving progressively to a more humane society as we go through the 21st century, that those ideas have largely been discarded, that we have seen the resurgence of evil in our communities, in our world. We have seen the resurgence of war as a tool, of the resurgence of global economy being used as a powerful motive for containing people in their socioeconomic bubbles without giving people access to either the economy or to power or to truth. So we have continued in our postmodern world to see how the tools of the modern world have not served us completely as we thought they might, and particularly as the 3Ms, Lily Montague, Claude Montefiore, and Israel Mattock, thought that the modern world would be the answer to our questions of how to bring justice and truth and wisdom to the modern world, and that's not happened. So, just at this moment when we are rethinking and reevaluating liberal Judaism, we can begin to rethink these issues and begin to think again about what are the tools that we can use to have insight into how to be a religious movement that is devoted to our fundamental principles of justice and humanity, inclusivism, and really a universal approach to humanity. So as I said, in the 1920s, people like Hillel Zeitlin, who was a journalist and a scholar, Martin Buber, who I'm sure many of you know as a theologian, as a teacher, Gershom Scholem as a scholar, began to reevaluate what was inside those Hasidic texts, those early Hasidic texts. They, in the 1920s, were thinking particularly about how to bring the Jewish people back to a religious dimension, away from secularism, how to integrate philosophy and science into a Jewish world, and to, again, be thinking about religious truth claims, which they realized were only partial. That is, as one faith amongst many faiths, global faiths in the world, we only have partial truth claims. Each of our faiths understands the world differently, and that we bring those truth claims to our sense of who we are as Jews. And therefore, when we do interreligious dialogue, of which NEO-HASIDISM is the leader, particularly in North America, then we bring our subjectivity and our truth claims in order to learn about others and to understand that we are only partially able to see the world and what it has to offer us through our own lens. Others beyond the 1920s then enter the picture, people whose names you may know. Shlomo Carlebach he leaves Chabad Lubavitch and becomes a very important North American teacher and musician. And I think many of you will know that Carlebach music has become part of even non-Orthodox Jewish liturgy, particularly Kabbalat Shabbat. And we may be singing Carlebach tunes and melodies in our liberal synagogues these days. There's more to say about Carlebach, but I'm not going to mention him again. Perhaps the most important contemporary thinker of Neo-Hasidism was Rav Zalman Schechter Shalomi. Rav Zalman, who was again left Chabad Lubavitch in order to become a Neo-Hasid, and was very involved in the beginning of the renewal movement in the United States, and has become a teacher and mentor for many of the current thinkers of Neo-Hasidism. He died in 2014, so just recently, and Marsha and I were privileged to host him in our house in Finchley a number of years ago. So he has been into Great Britain and has been involved in some of the renewal movement in the UK, but really had a huge influence here in the United States. And then we have Rabbi Art Green, as well as Rabbi Nancy Flam at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and Rabbi Melila Helner Eshed, who's in Jerusalem and who recently spoke at our graduation of Hebrew College and at our graduation ceremony. So there are new and numerous leaders of Neo-Hasidism all around the world, particularly in the United States, in Israel, and we can't discount the fact that people like Rabbi Rabbi Larry Tabik in the UK has been teaching some of this material for a very long time. I have to say, most of us as rabbis who went to Leoberg or HUC did not learn much of this material, did not see the early Hasidic texts as something to live by. We may have studied them, but usually as texts of kind of dead Jews who had lived 250 years ago. And it's interesting to note that these texts are becoming much more interesting and much more part of our canon of literature than they ever were before. So I want to just take you through some of the ideas of the principles of Neo-Hasidic thought, and then we can have some time to think and talk about it. I'm going to share my screen. Hoping you can see the slides. Margaret, just give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. Yes, Tom, thank you very much. Of course, the next task is always to make sure I can change them. Making sure, Tom, now you can see the first slide. Great, thank you very much. This is super, and I think we'll save my voice for a while, and let me ask, well, Alexandra, would you be prepared to read it for us? You'll have to unmute yourself.
We need to shift from a vertical to an internal axis, from worshipping a God above to the divine within. This does not only mean within the individual self, but within others, within the natural world, within Torah, within all that is. At the same time, we need to make the shift from divine other to divine all. Perhaps we should call that shift from worshipping a deity to true worshipful devotion to being.
Okay, it's complicated stuff, and as I say, I'm not going to try and unpack everything for us because I'm going to try and get to a number of these, but the most important idea here is that Neo-Hasidism wants to move from a vertical to an internal axis. That means away from moving from worshipping a God that is above, that is what we might call a transcendent God, to a God that is within. Now, often we think of the opposite of transcendence as immanence, that is kind of God within. But for Neo-Hasidism, the immanence is not just within people, but it's also within God's creation. So everything that is in God's creation has God within it. And that includes the Torah, that includes all that is created. And we have a name for this in theological terms. It's called panentheism. Panentheism. It really means that God is all and God is within all. And this is a huge shift in theology, and it moves us from what we normally have called a rationalist theology to what we might call an existential theology. So it is no longer depending upon the great ideas. In fact, I talked about this with Rabbi Leoberg, that the great ideas, the good, the beautiful, and the true, the Kantian ideas, this is no longer relying on those kind of Enlightenment 19th century ideas, but rather going back to an earlier sense of truth that comes from within, a truth that comes from within all that has been created, and that our connection with all is the way in which we come to know God. So as you can see, this is very experiential. It's very much about connecting all of the elements of human and non-human organic life, and trying to understand how we can bring those elements together. And when we bring those elements together, when we unify those elements, that is what Neo-Hasidism would call the deity. To worship that deity, to pray to that deity, is not so much as praying to a being or a force or an idea, but rather it is about considering where that deity is within us, our actions, our world, our ideas, our people. So it is definitely a shift from the vertical to the internal axis. Okay, I realize that's a very quick summary, but some of these are going to repeat some ideas, so you'll see them again. Rabbi Judith, I'm sure you'd love to read this one, if you would, for us.
The Judaism we're talking about is very God-centered, but we're rethinking how we use the word God. It's finding God as the breathing core of all being, the one that underlies and unifies all that is. In some ways, our central message in Judaism is a religion. Whatever else Jewish identity is, I don't mean to oppose ethnicity or culture. We're here over 3,000 years because we have something to say about God, with or without the G word. It's about finding a way to bring the divine into your life and to give expression to it. I've often defined a mystic as a person who understands that all of religion, the laws and the stories, the melodies and the texts and so on, are all there to bring you into the mysterious divine presence, and then bring that presence into your life. I think that this is our essential message, and it's the reading of the entirety of Judaism this way.
Okay, thank you. So this is called being a mystic, and this is not something we are perhaps familiar with, and something maybe we're not all comfortable with. What does it mean to be a mystic? But it is redefined here by Art Green as the ability to understand that our religion is to bring us into a mysterious divine presence. That Judaism is a religion, and that I think, like liberal Judaism, we want to emphasize and highlight that aspect of our religious experience. Yes, we understand it's a culture. We understand that we're a part of a people. We do understand that, and that there are those people who identify with those things strongly. But we and NEO-HASIDISM believe strongly that the essence, kind of going back again to Leo Beck, the essence of Judaism is reading the entirety of Judaism as a devotion to God, and a devotion to the kind of God that we've just defined as being inside all of creation and being within our very attempt to understand the wisdom of the world. So we have something to say. Neo-Hasidics believe they have something to say to the entire world, to a universal world, not just to a Jewish world, and that they feel that this truth is a partial look at how the world can be important and how humanity can create a sense of meaning out of that world. So being a mystic is not something you might at the moment identify with, but with more thought and with more learning about this, maybe it's something that we actually know we already are. Maybe there'll be a day when we're not afraid to call ourselves mystics and to understand what that means. Let's move on again. This one's called Inner Aliveness. There are going to be a few more of these, so I'm going to ask someone who's willing. Oh, that Marsha's there. Marsha, would you like to read this one?
Me? This Marsha?
Yeah, that Marsha.
Hasidism really relates perpendicularly to any form of Judaism, including Orthodoxy. It defines its teaching as the interior Torah, the Torah's innermost part. It views its mode of prayer not in terms of liturgical descent from the Ashkenazi ritual, but in terms of the service of the heart. Its field of action, it views with an inner aliveness, with kavanah. It views God, Torah, and Israel as one, but with two aspects, the outer manifest one and the inner hidden one. It strives to impose interior recollection, joy, and discipline on outer traditional forms. The spontaneous is preferred over the dryly habitual. Yet it demands a higher awareness and, paradoxically, a premeditation within the spontaneous.
So a complicated paragraph from Zalman Schachter Shlomi, written in 1960, by the way, so not, not new particularly. I think the first idea that's important to take out of this is that neo-Hasids don't believe themselves as another movement. They're not trying to be a movement like Reform, Orthodox, Masorti. They see themselves as perpendicular to all the other movements. That means coming at it, if you like, from a right angle, and that includes Orthodoxy. So they want to offer something to everybody, not just to Orthodox Jews and not just to non-Orthodox Jews. They want to offer something to everyone, because what they want to offer is this kind of sense of how to be alive in a Judaism that has a deep history and sacred texts, and how to get into those texts with an aliveness, with an openness. The second line talks about prayer, and this is going to be something we're going to revisit in a minute. But if you like, they're not looking to reform Judaism. It's not about trying to make something different than it was. So if you go to a neo-Hasidic prayer service, it won't be that much different from a normal service, whether Orthodox or Reformed, depending on where you are. What will be different is the approach to how people pray. So they're not looking to reform anything. They're not looking to play with words, or to change words, to change the liturgy, but rather to see whatever you do with prayer, that it is service of the heart. And I think for liberal Jews, of course, that goes straight to where we are and why our Siddur was called service of the heart, and why Rabbi John Rayner felt that was the most important phrase to use when designing and compiling a new prayer book in the 1960s. Funnily enough, written at the same time as this paragraph. So the inner aliveness with kavanah, which is a word I think we all know, is really important in neo-Hasidism. It's how to make things come alive, what is on the outside and what is on the inside. What it suggests when it says that we strive to impose joy on the outer forms means we want joy to be at the heart of what we do. Celebration, joy, spontaneity. These are the devotional aspects of being alive in religious experience. And that's much more preferred than just being connected to the texts, to the prayers of our prayer book, to the traditions. It is more about what we can do with them rather than what they are. It's in the last sentence, interesting sentence, it says that we demand a premeditation within the spontaneous. Now that reminds me of a very famous phrase I think we're all familiar with from Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, one of the early Hasidic rabbis, who said that what do you do before you pray? You pray, because you pray to be able to pray well. So that notion of preparing for prayer, being able to be mindful of what we do and how we do it, and come to prayer with joy, is part of the preparation that we need to have in order to be able to understand how to make this aliveness happen for us. We'll come back to prayer in a minute. Okay, there's just 3 more of these. So let's have someone else read. Paul Hyams, I see you there. Would you be prepared to read for us?
Yes, no problem. Techniques of prayer need to learn. Hasidism realized that it was not enough to say what one ought to do, but had to show how to do it. Prayer during the weekday is the laboratory for the refinement of the rational soul. On the Sabbath, it is the laboratory for the soul's absorption in God. The ultimate for Hasid is not heaven or the world to come. The ultimate is to be absorbed in the being of God. The Hasid practices that they might become a virtuoso. In prayer, they not only pray to God, but they make God whole for the sake of bringing about the union of the Holy One and the Shekinah.
Thank you. Prayer is really important for neo-Hasidism. It's one of the key tools, one of perhaps the key ways in which they want to devote their time and devotion to God. But prayer for them is a spiritual practice. It's not something that you can attend as you attend service. It is something that you do and you become a prayer. I suppose the analogy here would be to someone who has a spiritual practice, maybe someone who is involved with meditation or with the ability to say use yoga as a spiritual practice, or indeed something more secular like becoming a runner, someone who is a person who becomes someone who sees their practice as being involved in gymnastics or sports or running. That kind of an approach is something that takes preparation, energy, commitment, and dedication. You know, if you're a runner, that means that you run, I suppose, every day. It's not something you do just because you want to run to get the bus, and it's not something you do because you're late. Becoming a runner means becoming really devoted and committed, or a cyclist, or a dancer. It's something you are committed to, or piano player, something you are completely and utterly devoted to and committed to, and you practice endlessly to try and get to the point where your ability to perform is at the highest that you can excel at. That is the way neo-Hasids see prayer in the same way. And that is why a very interesting idea here that the weekday prayer is a laboratory for the Sabbath prayer. It's a preparation. And that when we get to the Sabbath prayer, Shabbat prayer, when we get to the experience of Shabbat, we're really trying to be in a different realm. That's an ecstatic type of prayer. Again, something that perhaps we are not yet as familiar with. And it's something that, in a sense, you need a spiritual teacher for, to have someone who is able to help you prepare for that kind of experience. Someone who can give you the ways in which prayer becomes part of your life. And prayer doesn't just mean going to services, but obviously we have in Judaism the wonderful opportunities for brachot at any times. In fact, 100 times a day is the tradition. So all kinds of ways in which a prayerful disposition becomes the kind of Jew you find God's presence in your life. And that's something that Neo-Hasidism really tries to emphasize. So we move on to spiritual experience. And Margaret, you haven't read for us yet.
I was hoping I'd avoid it, but no, that's fine. God is known primarily through experience rather than theory. Our neo-Hasidic spirituality grounds us in experience. Then through mindfulness, we seek a direct connection with the world as it is, striking to perceive the world in its own subjectivity. In this matter, we find each moment, each event, each experience full of life. We can sense God's vitalizing presence in our bodies and in the world. We neither deny the world as it is to sense God's presence, nor remove God from this world, having experience of the divine. Rather, we embrace a non-dualistic awareness of both, and there is both the world as it is, and there is nothing but God. In witnessing the myriad forms of creation, their variety and mystery, we reveal God within creation.
Thank you. So this last line, we reveal God within creation, goes back to what we said before, that panentheism, that everything that we do, everything we discern is the way in which God comes to be and comes to be in our presence. And that they consider that non-dualistic, meaning that they don't want a separation between kind of us and God, that God is within and God is part of and God is connected to. And we just need to find those threads of connection, those ways to meet the presence of God. This may sound familiar to you because it's actually the teachings of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was also a Hasid, as you know, perhaps more of the old Hasidic rather than what we might call the NEO-HASIDIC. But he certainly understood this theology as well. You remember when he went out to work for the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, he talked about his walk to Selma as an indication that his legs were praying. So this very notion that you can have an existential and experiential encounter with the divine through your activities, through your action. And of course, social justice is very much part of the agenda of the NEO-HASIDIC movement, and that is how we bring, again, the presence of God into being by being part of a social connection to what's called tikkun, the repair of the world, which goes back to mystical texts about how the world is repaired, and more complications, which I won't go into. So I think the essence of this paragraph is that we want to understand that the world as it is the world we have to work with. We can't deny the fact that we live in a world as we see it every day in the news. That's the world we have to repair and make better, and that we can do that not by pretending that our religion is something other than that world, but by noting that we are responsible and part of the world that we live in, and we have to do the work we have to do to ensure that the world is repaired and brought to a place where we can all be part of that discernment. Okay, last one. Mitzvot as devotional. And Nick, you're there, you are in Edinburgh. Would you like to read that for us?
Yeah, sure. Outer deeds are important. The mitzvot are the forms into which we pour our devotion. They call out to us to be fulfilled. There is no Judaism without ahavat ha-mitzvot, a loving devotion to our forms of religious life. They are the tools of our tradition given us to achieve and maintain awareness. Each such mitzvah is to be seen as a great gift and opportunity to stand in the divine presence in a unique way. At the same time, we need to recall that the mitzvot are means rather than ends in themselves. They are vessels to contain the divine light that floods the soul, concrete embodiments of the heart's inward quest. To live fully in God's presence is to do everything as though it were a mitzvah.
Lovely. So it sounds good, but we have to remember that for Neo-Hasidism, mitzvot are serious, important tools. The wearing of talit and kippah, of doing gemilut chasadim, of being involved in the world of tzedakah, of even going to the mikveh. These are all parts of the world that we've been given in inheritance, and that they are part of the forms of our religious life. Other religious traditions have other forms. We have these forms, and they are a great gift and an opportunity to stand in the divine presence in our unique way. We have the Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew language. We have the ways in which we perform our prayer services, and the ways in which we have our holidays and festivals. These are all the mitzvot. These are all aspects of our ability to bring God's presence into the world. They're like concrete embodiments of what they call a human quest, the quest for meaning, quest for purpose. And these are the tools we have at our disposal. Now, we've chosen some of them as liberal Jews, and we've rejected some of them as liberal Jews. And here again, we can begin to think in our 120th year whether we've got that right. You know, do we have enough Hebrew? Do we have enough of those mitzvot that we rejected earlier, that we may want to re-encapsulate, re-own, if you like. And as many of you will know, there is going to be a new progressive mikveh in London, as there is in Boston, which is completely different from the old style connection to mikveh, but rather is dealing with the issue of transformation of body in all aspects of our lives, and to begin to think about how water as a life-giving source brings an ability for us to think about a ritual of transformation. So I bring that as an example of where certain aspects of those traditions that we once thought were outdated, anachronistic, gendered, are now being rethought as important for an understanding of how this ahavat mitzvot, kind of the loving devotion to our forms of religious life, can give us purpose and meaning. Now there are others that I could give you, but I'm going to pause there because I think we've just got enough time. Oh, going to ignore that one. So there was a seventh one I was going to share with you about body, but that actually connects to this idea of embodying not just our minds, but our bodies in our religious lives. And that, of course, connects to what I just said about mikveh, also bodies in prayer. How do we use our bodies when we pray? Not to be thinking that we should deny ourselves who we are when we pray or when we do a mitzvah, but to incorporate the ways in which bodies naturally move and become part of who we are when we are involved in our religious lives, which is something that liberal Judaism, I think, certainly progressive Judaism, has tried to emphasize the life of the mind rather than the life of the body. And so how do we re-embody that into our religious experience? So we have 7 ideas here. We have the vertical to the internal axis, being a mystic, the inner aliveness, the prayer as practice, the spiritual experience, mitzvot as devotional rather than halachic, but kind of just ways in we can make our mitzvot devotional, and then the notion of embodiment, of using our bodies as well as our minds in our religious lives. So we're going to pause now, and I'm going to see if people would like to maybe pick one and to select one that they think might enhance their liberal Judaism, and in what ways it might do so. Is there anything here that you think might enhance your liberal Judaism, and in what ways could it do so? And I'm going to I'll put the list in the chat so that you can open it up and have a look at it. But Margaret, while I'm doing that, could you scan everyone just to see if anyone wants to start talking?
Got Michael Hart there. Oh, and then Alexandra.
Okay.
Michael, can I ask you a general question just before the dealing with the detailed ones you just asked us? When I think about original Hasidic movement, I think about taking sometimes complicated ideas and making them accessible to the wider Jewish community, often through stories and so on. It feels like this is a different, rather intellectual approach. Lots of jargon, lots of religious terminology, etc. Are these two completely different approaches? Or are there also NEO-HASIDIS who will turn things into accessible forms for the majority of us?
Interesting question. Thank you, Michael. Let me just say a word about the stories. The Hasidic stories came to us through people like Peretz, Shalom Aleichem, I.B. Singer, Israel Basheva Singer, Agnon, Martin Buber as well. They were all kind of translated into German and then into English, and became part of kind of the folklore about the Hasidic world. They're often romanticized. They're often given us a stylized view of Hasidism. That is the old Hasidism. That is not the neo-Hasidism we're talking about today. Now, stories are important for a number of reasons, but when you think about those Hasidic stories of the shtetl and all of that, that's not the kind of movement of neo-Hasidism that we're talking about today. Now, when you say the language that I've just given you is fairly esoteric, it's, I think, for 2 reasons. One, first of all, some of the material has to be written in such a way as to give us a sense of the experience of religion rather than describing religion. So we can read about religion in the philosophies that we have available to us. But when we read people who are trying to speak about religious experience from the inside, often the language becomes more poetic. If you've ever tried to read Heschel, you'll know that he's not easy to read because he doesn't give you an argument from the beginning to the end. He's not a systematic theologian. There are in our writings, particularly perhaps in the writings of Claude Montefiore and Israel Mattock, a real systemization to how, and John Rayner too, a real systemization of an argument, sets out an argument, describes it, sets up the frameworks for how you might think about it, and then gives you a conclusion. That is not the kind of writing that Neo-Hasidism can capture what it wants to say. It has to write in a way in which may seem less accessible, but as you get used to this idea of being on the interior side of devotional ecstasy, of the idea of devekut, of being connected and bringing God's presence forth, then the language changes a bit, and we will all have to get used to understanding that language. Now, we have some of that language in our prayer books. We have drawn upon the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, and other Hasidic writers in our prayer book. They are already in various aspects of our liturgy. So when you think about the language and you see another Hasidic quotation in a prayer book or an anthology or one of our rabbis' teachings, think about their language they're using and try and see it from the interiority of what they're trying to say. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure I answered your question there, but they don't.
I think the quotes we've got in our prayer books are more accessible than maybe. I'm not being critical of the things that you've provided for us this evening, but I'm not sure you could include those in our prayer book because they need the sort of commentary and explanation that you've been giving as you go along. Yeah. I just wonder whether is there a more accessible form available for people?
I'm sure we can find more accessible, but this is the theology and this is the hard work. But you know, when Heschel says prayer can bring water to, you know, there's the whole quote about the prayer bringing salvation, and I'm not remembering it right now, but that's a beautiful quote, and we have it in our prayer book. But it's not describing theology, but rather giving you an experience of what he thinks it is. Yes, sorry.
So I think Alexandra had a question, and then one in the chat from Darcy Lee as well. I'll keep looking for anybody else who's got questions.
Yes, so I was going to go to number 7, the body and soul, and the mikveh experience. Now, Rabbi Jacobi knows I've recently converted, and for me, it would have been very, very important to go to the mikveh afterwards. Now, that isn't accessible for everyone anymore. And I would feel that it's got a place for the people who would like to incorporate it. So yes, I think it would have a place in liberal Judaism, as in Neo-Hasidism. So I think there would be parallels.
Thank you. Yes. Over COVID, I trained to become a mikveh guide here in Boston. We have a wonderful mikveh called Mayim Chaim. It is used by all peoples, Jewish and non-Jewish, who want to attend for any kind of transformation in their lives, including conversion to Judaism, but also, let's say, graduation, marriage, ordination, divorce, even post-traumatic stress, rituals, all kinds of ways in which we think about how water can be a tool for understanding the transformation that in our lives and the ways in which we can take that as a ceremony, a ritual, an opportunity to again to mark a moment, to make it special for us. There's no reason why that tradition, which again is a tool of our ancient Jewish experience, why it should be closed to us as liberal Jews, and to understand how it can be used in a way that's not reminiscent of any kind of limitation that maybe the halachic system has imposed upon it. You know, we take all kinds of things today and give it new meaning. The counting of the Omer. We have included the Tikkun Leil Shavuot in liberal Judaism for many years. In fact, I believe that Rabbi John Rayner, who instituted it at the LJS, became one of the first kind of non-Orthodox rabbis in the world to ensure that this idea of studying at midnight at Shavuot was a part of a non-Orthodox, a liberal Jewish experience. So there are many ways in which we can take things that we thought were outdated, we thought were anachronistic, and bring it back if it has meaning and purpose for us as liberal Jews. So I appreciate your understanding there of the notion of one aspect of that. Margaret, did you say there was something in the chat there that I should look at?
There is, but I think it is 8:30. I wonder if we should just let people read it. It does seem more of a very interesting comment than a question, but maybe I'll make some announcements, and then if you want to reply very briefly, you can.
Well, let me just do the closing, and then you can do the announcement.
Of course, brilliant.
I just want to thank everyone for participating. I realized that we went through a lot of material in a short period of time. For any more information, please, come to me, and I will be able to refer you on to anything you want to read more about. I think Neo-Hasidism has got a future, and I think it's something for us to pay attention to. Whether we want to incorporate any of it into liberal Judaism, of course, is going to be up to each one of us and our communities. But I think it's worth keeping an eye on those people who are writing about it and thinking about it. And I know that it's a challenge to us. And I suppose, again, I just want to reiterate, I think it's worth thinking about the challenge in the light of the fact that at 120 years, liberal Judaism may have to rethink some of its ability to continue to be alive to religious life experience and to God's presence in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and we've got some comments and thank yous coming through on the chat as well. And I think you lived up to everybody's expectations. It did have some very profound concepts, but I think very important concepts for us to think about as liberal Jews. I would love to also reflect, but I think I'm glad we've had the chance to listen to what you've had to say. There's a question here about contact details, so I don't know if you're happy to put an email in the chat, Michael, or how you want to be contacted.
I'll put my email in there, yeah.
Lovely. Well, I just want to again thank you, and I want to remind everybody about two events that are coming up now for our movement. One is a meeting tomorrow night, which we're promised will be a lot of fun, and that's the LJ Ambassador kickoff evening. When you're invited, and you don't have to be an LJ ambassador to join this, you can come join Daniel Kaner for what is promised to be an informative but also an inspiring and a fun evening hosted by Daniel Kaner. And then next week, the speaker is somebody I've known even longer than Michael, which is my brother Rabbi Richard Jacobi from the East London and Essex Liberal Synagogue. And he'll be talking about another challenging subject, saying goodbye to woolly liberalism, which asks the question, how do we toughen up our principles? So I think it'll follow on very nicely from tonight, and I hope you can all join next week. So I'll say good night.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Michael.
Good night.